Okay, good morning, good evening, good night, whatever. Here we are again in our continuing 2x2 size, 2x2 foot size battles. What we're looking at here today is an experimentation as to whether a small game table can be used, can avail itself and its advantages in the mechanized era. Specifically here in World War II. So what we've done is we've already assessed the situation with the terrain and the size of the vehicles, and we've concluded that although in horse and musket era and eras of large numbers of troops in a hex, when going into the mechanized era where a unit of infantry, a stand of infantry is a squad, in the smallest sense, and in the largest sense, a full platoon. The vehicles on the hills don't look correct. They look way too big, and that is because the scale has automatically, if you will, modified, adjusted. For instance, in the horse and musket era, a single hexagon might be 100 yards. Just say it's 100 yards. And if you're playing, of course, now if you go into the pre-rifled era horse and musket, you could say that a hex is 50 yards. So let's say that now, as you've gone into the mechanized era, if a hex is supposedly in tune with the size of the vehicles, as much as you can do that. As you can see in this video, the hex is, say, 25 yards. Well, the vehicle on a hex overwhelms a single hill ridge. As you see in the bottom right-hand corner here, if you were to put a vehicle on there, it's as big as one of the hexes in 1/72 scale, which is what we do. So if we do this, it's ginormous, and it's way out of scale. So if you want to maintain hills that are of this size and use them in other eras, then you have to say that this ridge is really small. If it's just barely big enough to accommodate one vehicle, and even then it's dubious. So therefore, because of its size, we want to really say that it's not big enough for any vehicles to be on it, because what would happen in reality, if a hill was that small, a vehicle wouldn't probably be able to sit on top of anything, because the hill itself probably comes to a very sharp point. And therefore the vehicle is tilted this way or tilted this way or something. It's not going to be a flat ridge. Only in the larger hills, if you can call this a large hill, would it be possibly appropriate for the vehicle to be on that hill and look appropriate. So if we take this half track and we put it on there, well, now we're getting to be a little bit visually acceptable. But even so, it's extremely unlikely that that hill is going to be able to accommodate a vehicle and be maneuverable. The vehicle be maneuverable on it, because that hill is just very, very small. And therefore, it's not going to have anything like a flat enough area that you might see in a horse and musket era, again, because where one hex could be up to 100 yards. Here, if one hex is at the most 25 yards, then this hill is extremely small, just like the other ridge that we pointed at earlier. And in keeping with that, or because of that, it's going to have to be legislated that vehicles just can't be on hills. If you're going to have the hills in the game, they just can't be on the hills. The hills are too small, unless, of course, the hill is much bigger. Like, for instance, if we were to create a hill that was this entire span here, this entire area was a hill, then it would be possible. But as it is, this is not going to be accommodating to the 1/72 scale. So we had considered starting to collect and do a 15 millimeter collection in World War II. But the truth of the matter is, the vehicle's not going to be that much smaller. The truth is that 15 millimeter vehicle This is 172 scale. A 15 millimeter vehicle is going to be only just about as big as this back cargo area. And so if you were to look at that, say it's as big as a 15 millimeter half track is as big as this squad, you put this squad on there, or you put this half track in this area, and it might be a little bit smaller, but still, it's dubious. So switching to 15 millimeter, well, what about 10 millimeter? And then even further, what about GHQ micro armor? Well, now you're completely changing the situation entirely. If it was a GHQ micro armor, I say GHQ because that's the common associated company that makes 285th scale vehicles, which are, I believe, 6 millimeter, then it might be a completely different matter. The area occupied by a hex, 2.5 hexes, or 2.5 inches, this might be 100 or 200 yards in size, perhaps even 300 yards in size. Now that gets to be, well, let's just say it's 200 yards, okay. Because we haven't tried it, we haven't really understood the scale of it. But if it was a 200-yard hex and there were 3 vehicles in there at GHQ or a micro armor scale, that might be acceptable, but only even just barely, because of the fact the hill is very small still, even in that scale. And so if you were to go to something like 10 millimeter, well, now between 10 millimeter and 15 millimeter, there's a little bit of a wiggle room. 10 millimeter might be acceptable. But that again would you would have to consider the cost benefit of having to make an entire collection of 10 millimeter or non-172 scale. And so then, of course, you could say, well, wait a second. You're not going to need that many units anyway, right? Because, I mean, you're not recreating your entire 172 collection in 10 millimeter or 15 millimeter or GHQ. You're just going to have a couple of things, right? And so the answer is yes. When something like this is presented to us, where we need to have small game tables, small period of time, fast rules, and therefore a much more manageable environment, you also have to consider the fact that the terrain itself here is meant for 172, 176, 20 millimeter, 18 millimeter, blah, blah. Now, if you go to 10 millimeter, if you go, or 15 millimeter, you go to 10 millimeter, GHQ, micro armor, all these things have to change. Specifically, the tree height for GHQ or micro armor is way too big. These trees would be way too tall, and they would look it. Also, all the fences would have to change. All the buildings, basically the buildings have to change. Although these technically are almost 10 millimeter houses, not quite 15. But we've done that deliberately so they can be amongst different eras. Here you see a half track dwarfs the size of the hill, size of the house. So once again, these houses should be actually replaced with larger area occupation. So the houses should be true 172. If you're going to use 172 scale vehicles, the houses themselves, even though they may still represent different buildings in an area, they should still be, I mean, look at that. There's no way a half track is larger than a house, almost twice as large. So this is obviously a 10 or 15 millimeter house, if that. And the reason, again, was so that it could be used for multiple eras, but in the mechanized era, not so much. It's a representative, it's a symbol only of a building. So that's what we wanted to kind of demonstrate in this video. Another thing is when you look at the size of the bridges, again, the bridge is in an appropriate scale for the rest of the terrain, but by no means is that the appropriate scale for a half track, right? I mean, look at it. So that's not going to work. So again, it's an incentive either to switch to a smaller scale or to have a game that is much different than we have already considered for the other eras. And as a matter of fact, even things like cornfields would also have to change. Even though we've made our paper cornfields and they're fantastic, the fact is they're now going to be way too big for other scales. if you were to go to a smaller scale, those cornfields are just going to be way too big. And same with the fences. Everything has to change, essentially, because these are not really acceptable fences even for 15 millimeter. They're still too big. So those are the things we wanted to show in this situation where we are experimenting with using the 172 scale World War II stuff, which we in years, well, ever since 1970 really, large game tables were the norm. That is to say, at least 6 feet long and 4 to 5 or 6 feet deep. That is no longer the case, and it is no longer our interest to have games of that size, because the vast majority of people that we have talked to or have commented to us, they simply do not have time to invest in that in such a large, if you want to put it that way, game compared to a smaller game. The games have to be made smaller area, if not in scale, in order to be over quickly, because that is just about what people have time for. The aging of the population has a lot to do with that, and ironically or coincidentally, the lack of interest from the younger generation for games that are admittedly historical in nature is another incentive to make this as quick as possible, and so that if a group or a person's wish to have fantasy non-historical games at the same time as a historical game element event, then you can accommodate that. But one thing is for certain, accommodating all the interests out there is paramount to the continued success and longevity of historical gaming. There is no other conclusion that fast, reasonably sound working rules that make sense and terrain that is in scale as much as possible are the overriding elements that we are faced with, the considerations that we are faced with. And so this is, again, in summary, this is the experiment, if you will, of trying to see if it's going to work, and we just outlined in those various aspects why things have to change in order to accommodate these larger scale vehicles. But nonetheless, they are representative in their the terrain is representative, and we'll see what happens as we continue forward with this game example.